Today, on episode 41 of the Stoic Strength Trainer podcast, I'm interviewing James Tripp. James is an internationally recognized and respected thought leader, coach, and teacher. He's the developer of the critically acclaimed Hypnosis Without Trance approach to hypnosis, which was my first introduction to his work. We'll learn why James doesn't have a mission or purpose, and what he does instead to organize his efforts. We'll hear about the principles, maps, and models he uses to navigate life's challenges. We'll also discover what skill set James considers vital to being effective in dealing with others and oneself. This and more in today's episode. James has been and continues to be a massive inspiration and influence in my life. I've watched his YouTube videos, read his blog posts, bought his programs, and gotten live coaching from him. In fact, writing the Jim Kyridian, which regular listeners will recognize as the subject matter we're working our way through during most of these podcast episodes, was completed during coaching I was getting from James back in 2018. James began in earnest to explore personal transformation and self-mastery in 1992 when, at the age of 19, he saw the negative consequences of living from a fixed mindset, which he will describe in this episode. He began working professionally as a skills trainer and a people developer in 2003, and now consults in the fields of transformative coaching, change work, teaching, sales, and business leadership. His thinking draws from his diverse first-hand experience in philosophy, martial arts, many different styles, transformative hypnosis, and NLP, or neuro-linguistic programming. This is a solid 2 hours. Be sure to check the show notes for all the relevant links and some quick links to the episode content itself. Here we go. So thank you for tuning in, and joining me here is James Tripp. How's it going today, James?
Hello. I'm good. Yes, I'm excellent. How are you?
Very good. Thank you. I know it's a little bit later in the day for yourself. Here in Calgary, it is just after 7 o'clock, so not super early here either.
Okay. Yeah, it's 2 o'clock here in the afternoon, just after 2 o'clock. Right. So although it feels super early because I woke up super early this morning and went to sleep super late. So it's feeling a lot later in the day for me than usual.
Right. Okay. Well, we will just dive right in then. Just so that,
indeed.
Yes. If you need to take an afternoon nap. I know you have a lot on the go right now.
I might indeed take an afternoon nap. It's a rare thing for me, but I'm running a coaching group this evening, and I want to be on point for that. So I may well indeed take an afternoon nap. But that's not what we're here to talk about, my napping habits.
All right. Well, I'm going to just – I've got some things written down, and then we're just going to free flow. So I don't want this to be too structured. Yeah. So the first question that I have for you is, in regards to a purpose or a mission in life, do you have one for yourself?
That's a good question, because I hear so many people advising that you really should have a purpose or a mission. And I think there's a case that could be made to say that, well, we all must do on some level, some kind of something that unconsciously drives us. I think particularly that's not true, actually. What I would say is anybody who's out there in the world creating stuff must have some kind of drivers that play under the surface. Mm-hmm. They must have some kind of mission, whether they're conscious of it or not. And I'm actually not overly conscious of my mission. I don't have a mission statement for what I'm doing, in spite of having the advice from various business coaches saying, you really want to get a mission statement. I don't have one. I have things that inspire me. I have things that I get excited about. And I also made a choice some time back that I would like to at least experiment with living life according to my inspirations and enthusiasms and to things that have me come alive and feel more alive rather than shoulds and that sort of thing. So I tend to connect with whatever's energizing me at the moment. And there is a coherence to that. Otherwise, I'd be jumping in different directions all the time. There's obviously a coherence to that. But that coherence, as long as it's working, I'm happy for that to be taken care of at an unconscious level. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like there's something that's consistent for you, but it also is driven by your own interest and enthusiasm.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things is I'm a big fan of the kind of Carl Jung idea of individuation. Mm-hmm. There's all this stuff that wants to come through us as human beings. But the question is, how do we uniquely embody what wants to come through us? And when I say what wants to come through us, sometimes I look at myself as being a complete agent in my life. I am the creator of my life. I am the creator of my destiny. But sometimes I'll flip to another way of being, and I'll interplay the two. This is a yin-yang thing, of where life comes through me. I'm just part of the unfolding. So on the surface level, that can look like two contradictory ideas, but actually I'm happy for them to unfold. So that idea of individuation is like what wants to come through you? But instead of just letting it come through raw and unformed, how do you shape what wants to come through you in such a way as it creates the results that you want to create in your life, satisfactory results in your life? Mm-hmm. So, with regard to what wants to come through me, there are certain things that I love to do, and I love to explore things. So somebody introduced me recently, and I've jumped on it, to the word nexialist. Have you heard this word? A nexialist?
No.
So a nexialist is a person who sees connections between disparate things that may not normally sit together. And this is something that is quite natural for me, but it's something that I find very exciting, and it's always driven a lot of the things that I create in the world. So this idea that that this is somehow a part of uniquely how I am. It seems to be by default. So the question is, a lot of the time in life, I think we're raised to decide what we should be and get on making ourselves that, rather than find out something of who we really are and shaping that into something useful. So there's an idea from an old-time New Thought writer called Wallace Wattles, which is fill your current place fully. Mm-hmm. So to me, what that means, one of the ways I interpret this is, well, what am I about? What do I love? What has me come alive? If I were to ignore all the cultural recommendations to forget that and do what I should do, if I were to ignore that and to look at, like, what am I about? What has me come alive? If I live fully into that, but I shape that in a way so it unfolds out into the world and generates results, that to me is a much more interesting way of living. And that's what I've been largely exploring doing for the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so. And so far I haven't had to be employed by anybody else other than myself. So it's working well enough to keep me alive and cutting my own path in life.
So then do you, just continuing on with this, do you think that we have a nature then that's kind of inbuilt?
Yes, I do, but no, I don't. And again, I'll warn you ahead of time, Korey, that I'm a bit both and when it comes to most things. And the reason for this is we talked before in another conversation that you and I had privately about martial arts. Mm-hmm. And my background is in the Chinese Taoist martial arts. So right from my early 20s, which is, I think I was about 21 when I started to practice Taoist martial arts, I have been immersed in Taoism, which is, of course, like, and just so as people know, everybody's seen the yin-yang symbol, also known as the Tai Chi symbol. And this is part of Taoist cosmology. So this idea of yin and yang, the interplay of opposites, and how the interplay of opposites creates. This is a huge thing for me. It's been life-changing, life-shaping for me. So I tend to have a lot of both and answers. So with regard to, do we have a nature? Do we have a true self? I've had people ask me this before. James, I don't know who I really am. I need to find my true self. And I think that can be, for some people at least, some people have asked me about it, it's clearly a kind of neurosis creating quest. I must find my true self. I think, yes, there are sort of approximate loose essences. I think there are energies that want to come through us that might be sort of like uniquely us, and tendencies and things like this. But it's very much raw material. This is my view. So I think what wants to come through naturally, I treat as raw material, what wants to come up and what wants to come through. But then I get to bring a lot of consciousness to shaping the raw material. So that helps, I end up being in the camp of, I think there are certain qualities, essences perhaps to who we are, but that doesn't mean that who we are is some kind of fixed, immutable, rigid thing. So I'm both happy to be both informed and created and shaped by what wants to come through, and to bring consciousness to creating and shaping myself and my life. And for me, there's no contradiction there. Most people think that's a contradiction. Well, either there's a true me or there isn't, and I can shape myself to be who I want, or there's a true me and I have to sort of yield to that somehow or struggle against it or whatever. I don't think that there's an either or situation like that. Right. But I do think people have tendencies, and I think there are things that want to come through probably all humans as well. There's like probably universal archetypal stuff, and we get a lot of choice in how we shape that, how we bring that into the world.
I think that is a good place to stop that line of inquiry, because, talking about human nature, where does nurture fit in? I mean, that could be a 2-3 hour discussion at the minimum on its own.
Probably. Yeah.
We'll set that
It's
aside.
Definitely one that I've spent a lot of time with. I know that I could talk about it for 2 or 3 hours, because the way I was raised in my familial culture was very much you are what you are. Mm-hmm. So that's, it's all about, the way I was raised, it's all about personality traits that are fixed from birth, that are in your DNA, talents that are fixed from birth, that are in your DNA. And when I was growing up, that was really debilitating for me, and I didn't know it. What it actually did was set up the conditions where I would give up almost everything that I tried really early on. Because when anybody is learning anything or developing new skills or attributes, they will always hit sticking points. Mm-hmm. That always happens. There will always be at least 1 or 2 sticking points, often very, very early on. So what would happen for me as I was growing up is I'd hit these sticking points, and I wasn't consciously aware I was doing this, but I'd take that as an indication that I didn't have what it took to do this thing. So I was a quitter. I was one who quit easily and gave up. And I got extremely depressed in my teens. I mean, really seriously depressed. I was like having suicidal thoughts and all of these sorts of things. Because as I got towards about the age of 20, I had this idea that by that point, all that I was going to be would have formed, and there would be no changes. And as far as I was concerned, I was a loser. I was no good at anything, had no power in the world. I hated life. I was a serial complainer, a serial moaner. My mantra was, I didn't sign up for this shit, and I had a complete sort of mental collapse at about 19. And part of it was as a result of this idea that somehow our personality is fixed and our talents and traits are fixed. And I hated all that I saw. So it was distressing. And I had some, I suppose, partly chance events, a couple of turnaround events that helped me to see the world very, very differently. Make different sense of things. And for me, I would talk about that as a process, probably starting age 19, moving to between 19, 20, 21, where I really started to sort of connect into my power and agency to shape my life. So I had a complete reversal due to a couple of things, which I'm happy to go into if they're worth going into, but I don't want to lean into the topic too much if it's not the topic of the podcast, so to speak.
It might come up organically with the follow-up questions that I have here. So the next thing I was going to ask about is again, referencing that private conversation that we had before, we were talking about principles and the difference between a principle and a map of the world and a model of the world. And do you, in your life, have blatant or apparent maps and models that you use, again, to guide your choices or to help you navigate life?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the thing is, we all have maps and models of the world. We operate from them. We develop them as we grow up, and most people don't know what they are. So I'm very fond of saying that we human beings are poor witnesses to our own processes. We're also poor witnesses to our own inner, deeper structures as well. We're very bad at seeing what we see the world through. So for most people, a lot of how they render up the world remains unconscious, but it's influencing and affecting their lives, their decisions, their choices all the time. So I'm a big fan of bringing stuff into consciousness and looking at how we have our models of the world organized and bringing some conscious, intentional thought to that, doing some perspective taking in relation to it, maybe some critical thinking, and then starting to make choices. I did a video on this, I think for YouTube. Somebody was saying that they had a tendency that when they saw, they might be really enthusiastic about something, but if they saw that thing was popular, they'd immediately lose interest in it. It's a sort of a rejection of conformity. And the example they gave was they were really keen to learn Muay Thai, and then they sort of found that it was quite a popular martial art, and it was a bit mainstream, that's the term they used, and then they lost their interest. And there were a few other examples that they gave, and it was about conformity. They moved away from conformity. And what the person said to me is, I've tried reframing this, i.e. finding another way to realize my positive intention of avoiding conformity. And I'm like, hang on a second. Drop through to a deeper level. Look at how this is running the game in your life. Is it really serving you to continue to be always avoiding conformity? What that means is they're not valuing conformity, right? They haven't questioned that at all. They haven't gone into that piece of semantic material in their model of the world. It's part of their model of the world, but they're not seeing it because they're seeing the world through it. So, for example, if I found that I had something like an avoidance of conformity running the game in my life, or running the part of the game of my life, I'd want to know, well, where does that play out in my life? What is it keeping me from? And then I'd want to start going and going, well, where is conformity good? Because if I did embrace conformity, at least in some areas, or if I was able to use conformity, what if I could use conformity? So that's changing a relationship with something. Most people so I'm sure this guy would have said, I avoid conformity. To me, that's what you might call a victim structure. I don't have any choice with avoiding conformity. It's just what I do. Just part of my pattern to avoid conformity. But a change in the relationship there might be, what if conformity was something I could use or not use? And if I could use conformity, where is everywhere I could use conformity? And I pointed out, because this person's a hypnotherapist and is familiar with the concept of pacing and leading. Pacing and leading is conforming with something enough that you can then lead it in a different direction. So when we look at these things that drive us, there is usually an infinite number of ways we could relate to them differently from the outside in to those concepts, and also get into those concepts and unpack what they mean and shift them. And when we do this, when people do this, when you start to really work with the details of your worldview, the underpinnings of your everyday trances, the matrix of your own life, whatever, when you learn to do that, you can radically recreate your consciousness structures, your being, all of this kind of stuff. And that changes how you show up and engage with the world. It changes, this is Stoic strength, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I don't know if it was Seneca. I think it was Epictetus said this, right? I think. But the place that we have power, the only place we have power is with our choices and with our conceptions, right? I think it's Epictetus. Do you know?
They all basically said that.
Okay. Well, it's a pretty Stoic thing. The only place you have power is your choices and your conceptions. Yeah. Now, people could skip over that quite quickly and go, oh, yeah, okay. Maybe they hear the choices, because that's a kind of obvious thing. Most people get the concept of choice. They go, oh, yep, this or this, right? I have the power to choose. But that other bit with their conceptions, this is a much more slippery proposition. And what that really means, your conceptions, is the sense that you make of something, how you render it up within yourself. So we don't live in the world as it is. We're constantly rendering it up in our minds through our conceptions or how we conceptualize things. But what most people do is they take the concepts they're using and they never question them. They just think they're features of the world. It's like conformity. Somebody will think that's a feature of the world. Conformity isn't a thing. You can't weigh it. You can't measure it. It's an abstract concept applied to the world. But it might shape somebody's experience of it. So the stuff that in my work that I do, the developmental coaching work that I do, the place that I'm really getting into is helping people come to see how they're conceptually rendering things and to transform that rendering. So I'm working really with the level of conceptions and choice as well. Because if you don't, the two go together. Ironically, they eat each other or they feed each other. I don't know which way it is. Mm-hmm. Because your conceptions shape the choices that you see. But if you don't step into choice in its sort of, I don't know, archetypal form, then you can't work with your conceptions. So there's a sort of weird circularity between conceptions and choices, which can make it challenging for people to kind of bootstrap themselves out of their little patterns of being in the world. So this is where I help people, because as an outside agent, I can help people see what they've been seeing through, which is helpful. Mm-hmm. But it can be tricky to do yourself, particularly if you haven't yet learned to outframe your own conceptual sets and things like that. That's a tricky thing. Most people don't even know. As I'm talking about that, I'm sure a lot of people watching this will be thinking, James, what the hell are you talking about? You know, I am using technical terms for doing specific kinds of self-development work. So please forgive me, audience, for doing that.
Well, it makes me think of the concept of blind spots, and how can you be aware of something that you are unaware of? And I remember I read an article a couple of years ago where it was how to actually, it actually got me thinking, how can you discover a blind spot? And the article was talking about how you can't see the wind, but you can see the effect of the wind on the wheat as it waves down, as it's pushed down, and it's affected. And so, to my thinking, kind of to what your last point was there, is to discover these things that are hidden, these mental models. Perhaps we could look at, well, what's happening, and then try to imagine, what would I have to believe that this seems true for me, or this seems false, or this is bad, or this is good. Is that kind of the skill set that you're talking about?
Absolutely. And I actually have a name for this. I call it speculative semantic modeling. And what I mean by that is it's building a model of how somebody must think about something or might think about something that would explain their behavior or their way of engaging. Mm-hmm. Now, I do this with myself as much as other people because, we're strangers to ourselves. It's really hard. Like, there's a clip that I put on the front of one of my YouTube videos from Jordan Peterson, who is a controversial character amongst some. But I found, he's got some useful bits and pieces for me. So there's a line where in typical Peterson-esque fashion. He's saying, if you want to know what somebody believes, don't ask them. What the bloody hell do they know, right? And I just love that. What the bloody hell do people know about what they believe? Because the real beliefs that we hold, we don't know that they're beliefs. They're just taken as read. They're taken as facts. Mm-hmm. I don't think, I believe there's a coffee table in front of me. I don't treat that as a belief. That's in a different category. It's called a fact for me. And I'm not even consciously thinking about it. I'm just responding to the unconsciously held fact that there's a coffee table there.
Right.
So oftentimes when I look at other people's behaviors, coming from an NLP background, modeling is a big thing. The idea is basically that all human behavior is just patterns. And their patterns run in approximately the same wetware. So if you're really great at doing something, if I can crack that pattern, if I can model that pattern out of you well enough and take it on myself, I can do a fair approximation of whatever you can do. So you can model anything. You can model skills, you can model attitudes, you can model strategies, you can model tactics, you can model at all sorts of different levels. So this idea of modeling, this was a huge game changer for me when I learned this. One of the things that I tend to do, and I call this speculative semantic modeling, number one, because I'm speculating. So you say you see the wind, you can't see the wind, but you see the effects of the wind. Mm-hmm. So you infer the nature of the wind from its effects. There's a speculation there about the nature of the wind based upon your observations. So I'm doing speculative semantic modeling. It's semantic because it's to do with meaning making, the meanings we're making underneath the surface. So if you do something excellently, you have a way of showing up and engaging in a particular context in life. I want to know what meanings you're making. I want to know what the whole ecology of meaning making you're doing around that thing is. Because if I saw things the way you do and made sense of them the way you do, the same sorts of sensibilities, choices, behaviors would likely emerge. I mean, there may be some different skill sets if we're modeling something like, I don't know, pool playing. There's actual skill and coordination stuff involved with that.
Yeah.
But in other areas of life, there's less skill acquisition required. So I do that all the time, and I do that with myself because I'm mostly curious about, well, what am I believing in this moment that's having me behave and respond this way? What is the sense that I'm making that I've never questioned, that always runs outside of consciousness? And that's your point about blind spots. Because the biggest blind spot that we experience is to what we truly believe. It's very difficult to see what you're seeing the world through. So that creates a blind spot. And this is the point, again, going back to the Stoic idea of where you have powers with your conceptions and your choices. Those conceptions, they shape everything that we see, but they're invisible to us. By default, they're invisible to us. We can render them more visible. And that is often by looking at the consequences of them and backward mapping. I call that Sherlock Holmes coaching when I do that with people. Because it's like being Sherlock Holmes following that line of clues back to what must the sense making be that sits underneath of this. Right. And it's easier to do, and this is one of the reasons why, as a coach, one of the major things I do for people is facilitate perspective taking. Mm-hmm. Is to help them see what they have not been able to see and find their way to it, because it's a lot harder to do on your own. Of course, seeing your own blind spots is going to be trickier than somebody else who might be able to see them.
And that brings to mind I was writing an article, and I had it in an editing software, and then I would shift it over to the preview. And what I noticed was I would be in the editing phase, and I would look at the article, and I would think, okay, this is perfect, or this is excellent at this point. I'd shift it over to the preview, and it would slightly reformat it. So where one word ended on a sentence, it would actually be scooped underneath, and it would actually be in the middle of the paragraph on the preview. And because the words had shifted around, all of a sudden I could read it differently. I experienced it differently. And I realized, there's another mistake. And then I kept doing this. Like I thought, it's good. Put it in preview. There's another mistake. I'd put it back in editing. Surely it's good this time. And back and forth and back and forth. And I started realizing this is what, to your point, the value of a coach. Because a coach can take that perspective and say, no, look at it like this. And all of a sudden, now I see it differently, which is very helpful. And it's hard to do on your own.
I think that's what, to me, that is what coaching is at its most basic level. It is facilitated perspective taking. Facilitated perspective taking. Now, as a coach, I'll say that coaching isn't for everybody. There's that old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And I think that's true of coaching as well. When the coachee is ready, the coach appears. Mm-hmm. So there's a problem that can come up when coaching people. Now, a lot of people don't even realize there's such a thing as perspectives. They don't realize there's such a thing as ways of looking at things, or they may superficially acknowledge that concept. But what they actually do is they live their lives in right and wrong, true and false, is and isn't so. So they're caught in what I call the truth trap. Now, the truth trap says there are no perspectives, there are only truths and falsehoods. Now, when somebody's caught in the truth trap, they can't really be coached. And they can't really, they're very rigid in their being. They're very immutable in their being. They lose a lot of flexibility. And what will happen if I go to facilitate perspective taking with somebody who's caught in a truth trap? They will start playing a game I call arguing about what is or isn't so. Whereas when I'm coaching, I'm never saying to somebody, this is so. What I'm saying is, have you looked at it like this? And what happens when you look at it like this? But unless somebody can, and it can seem odd if you're a perspective taker, and I know that you are, I know you're somebody that does look at things from a variety of different perspectives. It can seem odd to think that there are people that don't do that. They just constantly seek the truth, what's true, what's not. And they're in or they're out of it. So that's like a prerequisite to coaching, but I think it's really a prerequisite to any kind of real self-development or change that takes place with intentionality. I'm a big fan of a guy called Robert Kegan, who's an adult developmental psychologist. And he points out that he was inspired by Jean Piaget's work looking at how children and adolescents develop psychologically. But Kegan pointed out, well, people don't stop just because they become adults. So what are the stages of adult development? And generally, so he's got these different stages. I'm not going to go into all of them now, but they essentially go self-sovereign mind, socialized mind, self-authoring mind, and self-transforming mind. So these are stages. Now, self-sovereign mind is very, very black and white. Self-sovereign mind is this kind of mind that things are true or they're not. Plain speaking, is or isn't so. Everything it happens at that level. The socialized mind starts to realize, hang on a second. Different people see things in different ways. It starts to become aware of perspective. But the socialized mind still thinks these are all different perspectives, but some are more correct than others. And one of these perspectives, one set of perspectives is correct. So the socialized mind is great because it enables people to take other people's positions and be a bit more aware that people might see things differently. But it can also lead to people being very torn as, this person A, who they have a relationship with and values, sees things one way, person B sees things in another way. And when they're all together, they're feeling torn and they often feel a sort of internal wrench. Self-authoring, people start to recognize that, hang on a second, it's down to me. There's an internal locus of power. It's down to me to figure out the truth in life. So there's less looking to others to find out the truth in life. And there's a recognition that perhaps we don't get to know the truth directly, but, we can approach it, these sorts of things. So it's very much I can author my own truth, but I'm still going to fall for the idea that there is a truth, that some things are right and wrong. Self-transforming really gets into the idea of there's 1,001 ways to think about anything, and they may be more or less functional, but, truth is a busted flush, and I'm not going to get there at all. But what it does mean is if I take a proactive view with this, I can be really radical in shaping how I relate to the world and how I relate to myself. So that's my kind of understanding of Robert Kegan's stuff. And so when you're working with coaching, it's good to know where this person's at that you're working with. Are they very much in the socialized mind? If they're in the self-sovereign mind, that first level we talked about there, they're probably not ever going to be looking for a coach anyway. Mm-hmm. They'll just think a coach is just some kind of like snake oil, fancy, I don't know, whatever. Somebody in a socialized mind, they might look for a coach. And it's going to depend on the situation. I mean, I've coached people under the banner of coach. I've worked a lot with military veterans who are transitioning to civilian life, who have had challenges transitioning to civilian life. So it's not kind of aspirational coaching. It's coaching, helping people who are meeting everyday challenges. So the people I work with in that area, there's a lot of people that they might not be in a self-authoring space, but they are in a socialized mind space. Mm. And often it's helping them get to being self-authoring, particularly with military vets, because a lot of them have joined the armed forces during their formative years. Mm. And they've been very much shaped by that context. Right. So they have a particular way of seeing the world and a particular set of values that works very, very well within an armed forces context and works less well out there in the civilian world. Mm. So there's a lot of values challenges and things going on that often people can benefit from coaching around. I've found a lot of military vets having difficulty fitting into roles in civilian organizations because the culture is so different. But you've got to be able to sort of recognize there's a game afoot, and that was one game, and this is another game, and we're learning to play a different game here. It isn't about right and wrong. Mm-hmm. It isn't about whose value set's correct and whose isn't. It's about, okay, here's a different game that we need to learn to play. It's time to adapt to play a different game because that one is now in the past. Often a lot of the people that I coach in that context, they are medically discharged, so they did not choose to leave the armed forces, and they would love to have remained mm-hmm. in the armed forces in the context they were in, but unfortunately they cannot. So that's a different kind of play, a different space from doing aspirational coaching or coaching entrepreneurs and that kind of thing.
Right. I can still remember when I was introduced to the idea that you can believe anything. It was something I found online, and I don't know if he was a coach or not, but it was just, again, a blog post that he had written. And he said, you could imagine that instead of the earth turning or going around the sun because of gravity, it's because of a giant penguin. I struggled with that idea that I can believe anything because, to your point, no, I only believe the truth. It took me probably less than a year, if I had to put a timeline on it, where finally I started thinking, no, that's absolutely correct, because otherwise, how are there so many different perspectives out there? There's got to be people who believe differently, and obviously that's true. Now, why is that? Because if I believe what's true and they believe what's true, where's the disparity here? Is it what's true, or is it just what we are imagining is true?
Well, I mean, if anyone's listening to this and they're interested in getting a really good overview of Kegan's work, my recommendation is don't read Robert Kegan for a start. There's a book called The Discerning Heart, and the subtitle is The Developmental Psychology of Robert Kegan, and the author is Philip M. Lewis. You can get it on Kindle. It's only 100 pages long, so that's a win. It's very concisely written. I really found that a useful book and a useful way in, and it helped me in life understand some relationship challenges that I was having with people, because people at different developmental levels will see the world in radically different ways. Mm-hmm. And they will arrive at fairly predictable conclusions when met with the seeing of a different developmental level, so to speak. So there's a lot of friction can end up coming about, which can be avoided when looking at things through that model. So I think it's a very useful model. I recommend it to people if they have an interest in such things.
Yeah, I'll make sure that I look that up and that I put it in the show notes so that people can have a look at it. Because that, for me, that's going to be something that I follow up on, because it is, as you were describing it, I thought, yep, I can see either myself where I might be at the moment, or where the levels are that I've gone through, and then where other people are. And
yeah. And I think one of the features, and I'm going to stay out of Kegan's levels, but a lot of people will take beliefs to be either, the assumption is like, if person A believes a whole bunch of things and person B believes a whole bunch of different things, one of those people is closer to the truth. Mm-hmm. And the functionality of a belief is dictated by how close to the truth it is.
Right.
Right. And I think that is an element to the functionality of a belief. But often, people organize their lives from metaphors. Metaphors are never claimed to be truth. They're just a way of thinking about something. But they can radically shape somebody's experience of it and drive a very different engagement with it. I've had an example recently. For a long time, I was thinking about certain aspects of my own business in terms of engines of income. And that dictated my whole engagement with things, because engines imply efficiency and maintenance and how well-oiled machinery and all of these sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And there's a particular engine of income that I was stuck trying to build and trying to maintain and trying to make work. It's taken me 2 years of not getting it operating the way it quote unquote should. Before I was thinking about this way, I had a very different sort of thing going on, and I've moved back to that now. And instead of trying to create a perfect engine that sits there and burns its fuel and gives its output and is all well oiled, I'm now moved to a different metaphor, which is that of building an ecosystem, more like a rainforest than an engine. Mm. And the recognition of it being more like a forest or a meadow or something like that, it entirely changes my choices in terms of the business, entirely changes, it changes everything. It's just such a different organizational metaphor. Mm-hmm. Now, the question is it true that a business is a rainforest, or is it true that a business is an engine? Well, no, here we're not talking about truth at all. A business is, I'm very, very fond of the phrase from Werner Heisenberg, which I've modified somewhat because he was talking about a specific context, but the universe is not only more complex than you think, it's more complex than you can think. So however you render it up in your mind, well, you can either be hooked into truth. Is that true? Is it true? Is it true? Or you can ask yourself, what are the implications for me of thinking about it that way? What does it change in terms of my experience of things? And what does it change in terms of my choices? And I think this is a thing that's recognized in Stoicism. I think Stoicism, and I'm not a scholar of Stoicism, I think that you're probably a lot more well-read than me. I think Stoicism isn't really trying to find the truth. It's not there seeking truth. It's not a truth seeking. It's not a metaphysical philosophy. It's an ethical philosophy. So it's concerned with wisdom for living. And that isn't really about truth. That's much more about what we were talking about the other day, principles, I think. Principles and ways of thinking about things that serve in creating, highly functional, adaptive, useful ways of engaging with the world, that produce better experiences, that reduce the amount of struggle in life. This is what I get from Stoicism. With Stoicism, I struggle less because I'm not burning up my bandwidth, wrestling with things that are outside of my sphere of influence. So it becomes more about an alignment with life. For me, there's actually a lot of overlap between Taoism and Stoicism, in that Taoism is about corresponding with the Tao, the way things are, learning to go with the grain rather than against the grain in life. And for me, there's a lot of that in Stoicism as well, if I remember rightly. There's the idea of going with the nature of things. Part of Stoicism, which is a very, very similar idea to aligning with the Tao.
And it makes sense that there would be overlap because that's wisdom. The goals might be different, but in the end, if I put it in these terms, the principles and the understandings are going to be, when they're boiled down, they're going to be very similar in nature.
And I think that's, this is something that, again, going back to truth, to me, ideas aren't about truth, but they are about working with the way things are. A good idea helps you work with the way things are, regardless of whether you get to know the way things are or not. And if you take that Heisenberg formulation, the universe is not any more complex than you think, it's more complex than you can think. And that would include every aspect. It's like you and I were a couple of human beings here. We don't understand the human brain. We got some ideas about it, but we don't understand it. We don't understand the true nature of human psychosocial dynamics. All we get is a bunch of ideas, heuristics, rules of thumb that enable us to work with what's unfolding in life. And to me, I'm always looking at different sets of ideas and how effective they are at helping me, to use a phrase from the physicist David Bohm, participate in the unfolding. Effectively participate in the unfolding of life. So as I'm able to both be a creator within the flow of life, to have will, to have intent, to bring that to it, but at the same time, recognize that I don't have control. I need to create with the Tao, with the unfolding, with the universe, with the nature of things. So there's a challenge in how do you create with the nature of things without knowing the nature of things? And I think the only way that you can do it, I do it in a very experimental way. So I'll take on a different set of understandings and ideas, and I'll treat that like an experiment. When I live life like this, what do I get more of and what do I get less of? So, in terms of my own self-development in life, it's just been a series of experiments in changing up the way I see things and the way I engage with things. And I'm constantly checking in, and I don't have like an outcome and saying, here's the perfect way to be. It's just better or worse. You wear glasses, so you've had an eye test before, and they put the lenses on and say, is it clearer like this or is it clearer like that? Yeah. That for me is life. It's those lenses are ideas, they're ways of seeing. And, my vision gets clearer and clearer, or my life gets better and better and easier. I get more able to create the kinds of results that I want to have in my life and the kind of experience that I want to have internally. That's the thing I enjoy doing, exploring life and finding different ways of being and doing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I really like that model.
In the world of coaching, you get a whole range of approaches, from the super clean approaches. So I'm trained in something called clean language. And the idea there is you just very, very gently, you avoid absolutely as much as possible suggesting anything to your client. And you just ask guiding questions with a minimum number of presuppositions, like, what would you like to have happen? Well, I would like to succeed in business. And when you would like to succeed in business, what kind of succeed? is that succeed,
Right.
right? So you just use the person's language, give it back. Super, super clean. And I'm well trained in this approach, and I value it and I will weave into it. But I don't hang out in it or stay in it because it could be really, really slow. And it assumes it's a great way of coaching if you yourself as the coach haven't done a lot of perspective taking and seeing yourself. Mm-hmm. So going back to that optometrist example again, I mean, I don't know, optometrists are changing now. Now they've got machines that do it. But go back a few years, they used to have like a rack of lenses, and they put these things up on. And the optometrist would make educated guesses based upon your feedback to them as to which lens to select and try next. So they would make educated guesses about the selection of the lens, and then they'd go, is it clearer like this, or is it clearer like this? And then they would pay attention to your feedback. So you've got a coming together there of expertise on the side of the optometrist, that they can make educated guesses on selecting lenses and then doing some testing this versus that and getting the feedback from you. And overall, ideally, as quickly as possible, you move to having a new prescription and you can see better. To me, that represents the ideal in the world of coaching, because if you go to the other end of being super clean, it's the equivalent of going to the optometrist and there's a rack of lenses there and the optometrist says, what would you like to have happen?
Right.
Well, I'd like to be able to see better. And when you would like to see better, what kind of see better is that? You know, and it's just, they might get there. They might lead you gently to picking up a lens yourself and trying it on in the end. But it's not necessarily going to be the most optimal process. On the flip side of that, if you had some arrogant optometrist who just looked at you and went, yeah, I know the glasses you need, these ones. And you went, whoa, these are all, yeah, no, they're the right ones for you. I can tell you that now. But hang on a second, everything's all distorted. It's like, no, this is what you need. Mm-hmm. You're just resisting it, whatever. So that's the other end of the spectrum. So I think there's a tendency for people to, particularly in Western culture, to be black or white. This is the right approach. That's the right approach. But again, this is my Taoist leanings. Mm-hmm. It's more like, well, here's something to offer on this end of the spectrum, and here's something to offer on the other end of the spectrum. But what we want to do is find the interplay. We want to find the generative interplay between these two apparent poles, I've been talking about Jordan Peterson again. I did a clubhouse room on transcending trauma. So I've been, because when working with military veterans, there's a lot of PTSD issues. So I've got experience in working with what are called traumatic events. That's a metaphor, and people don't realize it. But that's another story. A lot of people, like in the world of therapy, there's almost a split between people who are at the Jordan Peterson end of things, and then there's Gabor Mate's kind of approach. Do you know Gabor Mate at all?
I'm familiar with them. Not super familiar, but yes.
Right. So they're like yin and yang. Gabor Mate is super yin, and like Jordan Peterson's super yang. And often people who are kind of in the more Gabor Mate camp will look at some of the things Jordan Peterson says, and they'll think that he's callous and, unrealistic and just, doesn't give a crap about nurturing and all of that kind of stuff. And then people might look up from the Jordan Peterson end of things and think, oh, Gabor Mate's just too much about like poor lost soul needing nourishing, and there's no spine or backbone in it. So they might sort of tend to one camp or another. But in my view, I think that both of them have an incredibly useful perspective to offer. And I think could inform each other's work greatly if they didn't have to be in opposition and could in fact be in synergy somehow, because they're really poles apart, but that's an important thing. Mm-hmm. You get it in politics, individualism versus collectivism. It's like, which one's right, individualism or collectivism? Well, actually, there's a dynamic interplay between the two that is generative. You go too much one way or too much the other way, right? And it's problematic. And I'm not talking here, by the way, about, like a lot of people go, oh, right, you're talking about balance, James. you're talking about some kind of balance. No, I'm not talking about balance.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about a dynamic interplay of opposing forces. That's
Right.
not the same as balance. It's quite a different thing. More like Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher's flux of opposites.
Well, even in balance is very dynamic. If you imagine someone walking a tightrope, their arms are flailing, their leg is kicking out. I mean, there is a balance point, but as far as finding it, that's flailing all over the place.
Right, and that's the difference between balance versus balancing.
Mm.
And balancing for a human being is a dynamic process.
Right, yeah.
But if balance were achieved and there were no external forces, I mean, there's a word for that. It's called death. But even then, so life, I think, is an inherently, it is an unbalanced thing seeking balance. That's kind of what drives, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a thing about, when people look at the world today, they go, wow, this is terrible. And what's the right solution? What do we need to do? People put the world to rights and say, well, they need to do this and they need to do that, as if there's some kind of like finite game that if we could win it, everybody would just live in peace and harmony forever and ever,
mm-hmm.
in balance, in a harmonious balance.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the destiny for the human race. That the destiny for the human race is constant disequilibrium and seeking equilibrium. And it's those two opposites that actually drive everything. And so this is a Taoist thing. That's the nature of the Tao. So in trying to seek this still point, where it's over, the game is over, the dynamic interplay is over because finally balance has been attained. Well, if we did succeed in that, then what? Then what happens?
Right.
It's probably the end point of life, I don't know.
Or it's just stasis. And nothing can change. Okay, nothing can change now. This is it. I've achieved it.
Yeah.
And that's not how things work.
Yeah, and I like that. I think if you look at the history of Western thought, in my mind, it started to go awry around about Plato's time, generally speaking. And I'm not saying, I don't want to say no one's had a good idea since before Plato, or Socrates maybe even. But looking at the sort of pre-Socratic philosophers, and particularly for me, Heraclitus, that idea, that dynamism that was recognized by Heraclitus, I think, somehow this idea of, Plato comes along with this idea of ideal forms, and it's no longer about the dynamic world. The dynamic world is claimed to be a shadow of the true world, which is these perfect, immutable forms that exist unchanging through time. And to me, it's the deification of abstraction what you get with Plato. But that's probably way off topic. I'm sure that's getting too chin-strokingly philosophical for people. So we'll go in a different direction.
I was thinking that these first two questions were very high level. They're very abstract in a way.
Yeah.
Because, purpose, mission, principles, maps, models. So maybe we'll swing it to a little bit more practical, and it'll be a little bit quicker, and then, we can make sure that you get your afternoon nap, if that's a possibility still. Yeah, so you have a lot of different roles, as we all do. Some of your bigger ones, you're known as a hypnotist. That's probably one of your bigger perceptions, or people perceive you that way. You're a coach, you're an entrepreneur, you're a father, husband, all that. But if we're looking at skills now, do you have a skill set that you consider to be vital in all those different areas or those roles that you have? Is there one that seems to kind of map across all of them that you use?
Well, certainly, I mean, in terms of really super pragmatic, practical, or at least I think pragmatic and practical skills that I've worked on. for a lot of years, I quite deliberately and intentionally worked on my communication skills. And in a variety of different ways. So I studied language models from neurolinguistic programming, so hypnotic language models, which can also be used in what's called conversational hypnosis. And I studied also, there's a model in NLP called the meta model, which is a model for listening to structures in other people's language and being able to kind of laser focus in on different aspects. It's a great way to annoy people, but it's also it's a pretty cool thing if you never want to lose an argument again, in terms of what I call showboat argumentation. So you could have an argument with somebody. You and I could have a debate,
right? And
neither of us may succeed in convincing the other, but one of us might win the debate according to the viewers of the debate. So like a lot of political debating, in fact, all political debating, it's not really about politician A changing the mind of politician B. It's about politician A winning that sort of competition in the eyes of the viewers. That's a really important thing to understand in communication, because some people get confused between the two. They use the strategies that might look good from the outside in for winning arguments to try and change another person's mind, and they do not work. It's an entirely different game. So I've looked at language and communication from a lot of different perspectives, from the perspective of influence, from the perspective of mediation, from the perspective of presentation, coaching, these sorts of things specifically. And I had a real fascination with that. I spent a long time doing public speaking training via Toastmasters, which I think is an excellent format for anyone who wants to develop presentation skills. I've done presentation trainings, done improvisational theater, which I didn't do to perform. I did to develop my ability to create in the moment in a communication context. Storytelling, all sorts of things. In a sense now, it's a really kind of interesting thing that is something people will put in the category of soft skills. It's not like mathematics or, engineering or something like that. It's a soft skills thing. But for me, most of what I do is based in communication. So I'm using language and communication to literally shape my life, not just to communicate information to people, but to evoke experiences in people and do perspective shifting, mind shifting, that kind of thing. So I've put a lot of work into developing that, and nonverbal communication as well. I don't want people listening to this thinking I'm just talking about language. So that's definitely a skill set that's paid off for me. There's also the internal skill set for me, which has been a much more kind of private thing of learning to work with my own. We've talked about this, but that's a skill set as well. I mean, it may have sounded earlier on, I was talking about some abstract principles of how minds work and how we can work with our own conceptual systems. But that's a skill set. And that's the thing that people often miss. I get this how-to question a lot. James, but how do I do that? Right? Which is a bit like saying to somebody who the current Wimbledon champion, whoever that might be, so how do you win a tennis match? Like as if there were a series of instructions rather than it being the result of an embodied skill set. And, ultimately the answer is, well, you do it by being good at it and being better than your opponent on the day.
Right.
There is no step one, step two, step three to it.
Yeah. Completely abstract at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. But that doesn't mean, it's both abstract and it's both highly pragmatic and practical at the same time. So a lot of the stuff, now, one of the things about internal skills, mind skills, is I find them even harder to teach. I mean, I've taught martial arts. Now, the thing about martial arts is you can look at what someone's doing and you can go, okay, so, and you can say, okay, so notice your shoulder here. Just let your shoulder release a little bit more. Drop down a bit more into your stance. That's it. Okay. Now make sure you breathe when you're moving. You can give very obvious bits of feedback because you can see what's occurring. But in the kind of coaching work that I do, sometimes, most of the time I'm coaching people in terms of I am there as a perspective taker for hire for them. But I'm also often working with people at the same time to help them develop their capacity to take perspectives themselves, which means noticing within, being able to pay attention to the internal feedback signals as to when they do this versus this, things that most people are not really aware of. But it's a much more challenging thing to train people in because you can't see it the same way. You can't just make an adjustment. If someone's juggling, you can say, okay, so you're throwing the ball a little bit high there. Just relax off a little bit. And do you see what I mean? It's very easy to give feedback, but it's a lot less easy because you can't see inside of somebody's mind and see what specific maneuvers they're doing, what they're doing or what they're not doing. Much more challenging. Yeah. And there are endless considerations. Particularly, it's interesting in the world of martial arts. Take something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu comes from Judo, not that long ago. So Judo turns up in Brazil. The Gracie family learned Judo. And then, which I can't remember, the sort of patriarch of the Gracie family, he was not a robust fellow. So he kind of started to really work on finding ways that didn't require a lot of strength and a lot of vigor and this kind of thing. Now, most BJJ people who go to Judo, they're in for a rude awakening because the energy is so different. BJJ is like super technical and it's all about kind of relaxation, fluidity and all of this. But like Judo has a different intensity to it. It's aggressive. It's high energy. It's super dynamic. It's got a whole different feel to it. Now, you could say, well, what's better, Judo, BJJ? What's better for whom? What do you want to do? Do you want to take on, like, if you're kind of mellow nature, maybe some, stoner BJJ? Do you want to? Are you going to just take on? Yeah, man, we're going to roll on the mat. It's going to be great.
Right.
Or do you think to yourself, actually, do you know what? Judo would really serve me because I would like to bring out more of that explosiveness, more of that fierce edge, more fierceness. So these things, and this is where, like, looking at martial arts, a lot of the time people get hung up on their efficacy. But does it work? Is it the most effective? Okay, yeah, cool. Those are great questions to be asking. But the other question is there can be some fantastic stuff in different martial arts that can serve as vehicles for developing things within yourself, should you wish to do so. And you get this in hypnosis as well, because you get old school direct hypnosis, and then you get more Ericksonian sort of permissive hypnosis. Maybe old school direct is more Judo and Ericksonian is more BJJ. Or old school direct is more traditional Shotokan and, whatever it might be. Right. But you get a lot of people, for example, they have a very yin nature. They're very permissive in their nature. So they get drawn to Ericksonian stuff because it's a very permissive kind of style. Or you get people who are more authoritarian in their nature, so they get drawn to old school direct hypnosis because it suits their tendencies and their style. But the truth of the matter is like, if you look at Erickson, right at the center of it, he may have been very permissive and very dexterous and flexible and adaptive. But underneath, he was really clear where he was taking people. He was really clear what he wanted to show people, what he wanted to open people to. So he had that yang nature underneath of a yin set of applications and engagements. And this is the problem with a lot of people that learn Ericksonian hypnosis now, is they have a yin nature underneath a lot of these yin engagements. Or a lot of people that learn old school or authoritarian, they have a yang underneath of yang. In Tai Chi Chuan, Taoist martial art, that's called being double weighted, because Taoist martial arts are all about the interplay of opposites. And you don't want double yang or double yin, bad outcome. So I think this is a really interesting a really interesting thing to look at, because yes, we want to bring what we've got to bring, but we want something that's going to complement that. And that doesn't necessarily mean something that's going to be so synergistic with it that it doesn't take us beyond, it doesn't add anything to what we've already got necessarily. Mm-hmm. Why am I talking about that, Korey? What question did you ask me? No short-term memory.
What's happening here is that I'm asking you a question, but then I'm actually listening to you and I'm asking a follow-up question. And that's where we kind of get a little bit into the weeds. So I originally asked, is there a skill set or a set of skills that is consistent for you across all of your roles? And you said, yes, communication. And then you started to get into the skill of looking at, maybe I could put it as how you communicate to yourself. And then we got into some other metaphors about life. And
well, there's another metaphor I use a lot, which is semi-tongue-in-cheek. And it's just fun because in the past, like the term coach, for example, I'm known as a coach to some people. I do some coaching. I didn't think of myself as a coach. I didn't set up going, I want to be a coach in life. Right? That wasn't my aim. That wasn't my goal. And sometimes, like, because when you take an outside category like coach or personal trainer or whatever, mm-hmm. there's suddenly the question of, well, what does a personal trainer do? How should I be acting as a personal trainer? You're sort of like, there are certain outside standards. Other people will judge you according to their idea of that category, right? So you might end up training somebody and they go, hey, you're completely unprofessional. You should be doing more of this as a personal trainer, right? Because they've got their idea of what that means. So I kind of have these private categories for myself, which I don't necessarily use publicly as marketing frames or anything. But I think of myself as a brain wrangler. Mm-hmm. And it's a semi-humorous term. But it is, in fact, the most accurate term. Because if you think of like somebody wrangling cattle or something like that, you're not really controlling the cattle. Right. The cattle all have minds of their own. They're going to do their thing. You've got to corral them somehow. You've got to get, there's a craft to getting these sheep through that gate or these, whatever it is. So like when I'm working with other people, there's a perspective, there's something I want to get somebody to see. And it's like, well, how am I going to get them to see it? Not because I think they have to see it that way, but I want them to just take that vista for a moment and see what it offers them. But I'm doing it with myself. Brain wrangling is an internal thing. So how am I seeing things? How am I making things up? What are the implications of this? How is this playing out and unfolding in my life? Do I like the results that I'm getting? Mm-hmm. And if I want to change the results, I want to go back to the source, which is my seeing and my being. It's not my doing. Right? It's my seeing and my being. And this is the thing about skills. You're asking about skills. Skills are golden. If you take the be, do, have model, okay, this is a model I like. It's a simple, rough cut for how we do life. Mm-hmm. Be, do, have. Have are the results that we get. Do are the things that we do to get those results. And be is how we are being in ourselves and how we are seeing the world and making up the world on the inside, our conceptions, as they say in Stoicism, from which the behaviors emerge. Now, this is how people really work. Be, do, have. The font is always inside, mm-hmm. in our conceptions of the world, as to put it in those Stoic terms. But we get raised to believe in a different model, which is just the do, have model.
Right.
So people always ask, well, what do I need to do? What do I need to do to get that? What do I need to do to get that? And oftentimes you can tell somebody exactly what they need to do, and they don't do it. Mm-hmm. And I have people say to me all the time, James, I know what I need to do. I'm just not doing it. Why? Because you're at odds. You're trying to do a doing that's at odds with your seeing and your being. And that's when procrastination comes about. That's when struggle comes about. And people go, but I should do this. I know I should do that to get that. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe you should, but what are you going to do? And ultimately, when people are struggling against themselves, against their own seeing and their own being, because they're using their superego to decide what they should do, if they're not doing it, they will never win the game of trying to force themselves to do it consistently. They need to go back and look at those conceptions. And this is going to the Stoic thing, your conceptions and your choices. The choices, you might say, well, that's about my doing. But if you don't have the conceptions to support those choices at the level of doing, you won't do them. In order to do something, you have to believe you can do it. In order to choose to do something, you have to believe you can do it. If you don't believe that you can do it, you will never choose to do it. Mm-hmm. Self-concept is destiny, as I think Nathaniel Branden put it. So that's the place. And this is why, for me, with coaching, the coaching that I do with people is all about seeing and being. I am not an accountability coach. Some people try and hire me as that. I just need someone to kick my butt when I don't do the things I should do. Okay, go hire someone else. Mm-hmm. That is a boring job for me to do. So I don't want to do it. And I don't want to end up struggling with somebody against their own conceptions. So if I'm coaching somebody, if they're not willing to go to their own conceptions and start looking at things at that level, I don't want to work with them. I don't want them as a client. Mm-hmm. That's the font. That's where they have their power. And that's where I need them to be willing to go.
Because then they actually are not having somebody else say, well, this is what you should do. Until in the end, they're actually saying, no, this is what I'm going to do. This is who I am.
Right. This is what I'm doing. This is what I'm going to do. And that's the thing. Like, I like the fact that you said, this is what I'm going to do here, not this is what I want to do. Mm. So this is what I should do. That's really low grade. This is what I want to do. That's an upgrade. This is what I'm going to do. That's a further upgrade. This is what I'm doing. That's a further upgrade. And action happening right now in the moment is the ultimate place. Yes. And this is where, I talk about creators, people who are creators. And a creator to me is not a creative, not somebody who works in the arts or in fashion or something like that. It's just simply somebody who's a difference maker by default. They're constantly going, what am I doing? What's next? What's the difference I'm making? You look at creators, they almost all live in action. They live in the active present. Mm-hmm. They're not spending hours and weeks going, well, should I do this? I should do that. I should do, so I've done a lot of modeling of people who live in the active present and create. Richard Branson's a great example. I've got my issues with Richard Branson on an ethical level. But putting that aside, I am fascinated by him as a character, and I've read his autobiography twice, I think. Mm-hmm. And a thing that comes up is he sort of gets up in the morning and he goes immediately into action. And it's not an action based on what I should do. It's an action based on his inspiration in the moment. So you'll read things in his book, like he'll say, so it occurred to me that X, Y, and Z. So I picked up the telephone so immediately an occurrence in his thinking expresses into action in the world. And you can see this in his style of speaking. Mm-hmm. This is part of what I call speculative semantic modeling. I'm looking at how people talk about and discuss their reality and these sorts of things, and what are the implications of that. But that thing for me, the active present, living in the active present, the world doesn't stop. The unfolding continues moment by moment by moment. And to me, people who are really prolific, creative forces in the world, they're never hanging about. They're never there coming up with a long game and then meticulously implementing that bit by bit by bit by bit. They're always willing to come back to this moment and go, what's next? What's next? Mm-hmm. What's next? What is it that needs to change? Yeah. And that doesn't mean that they don't come up with plans and outlines and things like this. There's value in that, but they don't become attached to them either. They're alive to the moment and ready to nuance something up or shift it slightly. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that I very much love. I call it nonlinear generative engagement. And again, as a coach, I'm very much biased towards that. So if people hire me as a coach and they hire me for, say, creation coaching, I make it clear I have my biases. I am not going to help somebody just like I'm not going to kick their ass. I'm actually not going to help them necessarily kick their own ass. Right? I'm going to help them shift to a way of engaging with the world that works. And I happen to think the world is dynamic, and it always is dynamic, and it is dynamically unfolding moment by moment by moment. And if we are not dynamic alongside it, along with it, then we're constantly dropping out of flow with it. And the more we drop out of flow with life, the more odds we are with it. So it's a matter of like being in sync with it, but it's not an in sync as in go with the flow, get washed along by the tides. It's being in sync in a way that dances with it. So I often use the metaphor of dancing results out of reality,
right,
which is different from like, right, that's what I want to do. I want to achieve that thing over there in the distance. So I need to do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. And it's like, that's when people find themselves in procrastination, because each one of those steps is about a sacrifice of the now to get somewhere. Whereas if you look at somebody like Richard Branson, every one of his actions is a setting something in motion right now. Excuse me. So that's a way of living that I have a bias towards. And I want to make it clear, I'm not saying there isn't a time and a place for occasionally going, right, I'm going to do this piece of self-sacrificial work to get this result. I think you can do that. It's just the problem comes about when people try and live from that and in that the whole time. That's their only idea of how to get results in the world. And it becomes a chronic way of being,
right,
rather than just a choice.
Yeah, I call it very similar thinking. I call like a pseudo choice. I call that thinking choice. It's like that choice where somebody's, okay, what do I need to do to change my life? And then they think, oh, I know what it is. And then they think that's a choice. And then they just go on with what they're doing. They don't do anything. And what you're talking about Richard Branson is he has that thinking choice, but then he makes it an enacted choice. So it actually is a choice, because he thinks, oh, I should probably do X, Y, Z. And then he immediately embodies that by picking up the phone and making a call, making a connection, reaching out, whatever it happens to be. And so I suggest to people that they disregard their thinking choice as a choice at all. Consider that a pseudo choice. And it's only your behavior. It's only what are you doing? That is the enacted choice. Then you know, okay, now I actually did choose to do that. Whereas everything else, that's just a nice idea, a little fantasy. But until there's motion, just kind of think, yeah, it was just an idea I had. So then you can actually see what your choices are.
I think that's a huge thing. And I subscribe to the same model, but with generally different language. But I like that language of choice versus pseudo choice. Because what I often say to people is, look, a choice inherently contains action. It is action. A choice is an action. And if it's not an action, it's not a choice. So there's that old joke of there's 5 frogs on a log and 3 of them decide to jump off. How many frogs are on a log?
Right.
Well, there's 5 because they merely decided to jump off.
Yeah.
So to me, a choice, I only count a choice as a choice if it is expressed into action.
Exactly.
I can choose to step out the door over there, or I can choose to stay in my chair. But until I do one or the other, I haven't chosen. There is no choice. I'm choosing right now to stay in my chair. And if I say, well, I'm going to leave now, I haven't made a choice yet. Yeah. I'm making a proclamation about some sort of vague intention in the future or whatever. Yeah. But I like that distinction of choice versus pseudo choice. I've often drawn the distinction of choice versus decision when I do the 5 frogs on a log. But actually, I think pseudo choice is a better way of thinking about it. I like that. Thank you. I'll be stealing that from you, Korey. That's good with you.
Yeah, no worries. So if you have a few more moments.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not going to, so what I won't do now is I won't do any follow-ups. I'm going to ask
Mm-hmm.
you 3 more questions. So answer only as much as you want. So the first one is, do you have a time management system to help you be productive?
Yes. And I use it sparingly. And the reason I use it sparingly is because I have a distinction of productivity versus generativity. And I have a bias towards living in generative ways. Now, the difference between a generative, there's this quote, you've probably seen me sharing it because I'm always sharing it, from Steve Jobs: "You cannot connect the dots looking forward, only looking backward." Mm-hmm. That to me is one of the best markers of the idea of generativity. Because when we are generative, we take actions in the world that produce results, but those results can surprise us. We can go, wow, look at that. I never saw that coming. Or, look, isn't that cool? I did this and then this and this happened. So generativity is fundamentally non-linear. And it produces surprising results. Productivity is linear, and it produces intended, predictable results. Now, I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong. The thing about productivity is it almost never, the more productive you become, the less generative you become, less surprising the results, the less interesting, like fruit blossom that you never saw coming. So my bias is towards generativity over productivity. I will take generativity as my default, but sometimes I will put myself under the yoke of productivity, so to speak. So I'll go, right, here's a thing that I want to get happening. Again, as I said earlier, I don't want that to be chronic. I don't want to live that way because it leads to burnout, can do, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it can also lead to nothing remotely surprising ever happening. Mm-hmm. And I think that, as Steve Jobs puts it, truly creating in the world, you cannot connect the dots looking forward, only looking backwards. So my bias is towards generativity. That said, when it comes to productivity, here's what I do. The major thing is I organize by time and not task. This is partly going to be what works for me. I am a rebel. I have a problem with authority, even if that authority is my own. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, if I set up a series of tasks, if I do a to-do list, the first thing I will notice is mostly my energy level will immediately drop. My mood will fall. I will become uptight, grumpy. I may procrastinate. I will certainly always put more than I can possibly achieve on my to-do list, because when organizing by task, everything runs over time and often over budget too. And then I will, at the end of the day, probably be grouchy and grumpy because whilst I got things done, I didn't get nearly as much done as I intended to get done. So I will end up in a low vibration state from that. And that is not a place I want to live from, and I don't think it's particularly creative. So I will organize by time primarily, and I never do a to-do list. I always do a to-don't list. Hmm. So let me give you an example. Let's say I'm working on my book, and I know if I organize by task, there's all these chapters that need to be gone through and all this stuff that needs to be gone through. There's a mountain ahead of me. And I just think, and then I have to motivate myself to tackle that mountain. Mm-hmm. If I organize by time, the principle of organizing by time is time spent with. So time spent with writing the book is the only way the book gets written. So my aim becomes to spend time with. So I do a deal with myself. Okay, how much time spent with the book seems like a drag? Well, if I go, I'm going to spend all day today on it, then I'm going to procrastinate about getting going. No question about it. Mm-hmm. So I will start to shrink the amount of time. And let's say I get to 45 minutes. If I get to 45 minutes and I go, I'm willing to do 45 minutes, then I won't procrastinate anymore. So now I carve out 45 minutes. What I will do with that is I will put my phone timer on for 45 minutes, I will write up on my board, book writing. I will write underneath of that, to don't, which is the opposite of the to do. This is everything that I must not do and will not do. I will not go on the internet. Or if I do, I will go on for a specific reason that relates to the job and do nothing else. I will ignore all links, right? So no clicking side links, no responding to notifications, none of that. I will not make tea. I will not have conversations with my wife or my children. I will tell them ahead of time. I will not be speaking to you for X amount of time. I will not, and I will put on anything that I might use as a distraction or a procrastination strategy on the to don't list. So now I'm doing 45 minutes, quality time with the book, and I am not doing any of these things. I haven't specified what specific tasks I'll do that relate to the book. The agreement is I can do anything that relates to bringing the book into the world, anything I choose in that moment, so long as it really relates to bringing the book in the world. I will do whatever is in front of me, whatever first comes to mind. And then the deal is, and I put my phone on airplane mode as well to cut down notifications and phone calls and things like that, because answering the phone is also on the to don't list. Then at the end of the 45 minutes, the deal is when the timer goes off, I can do anything I choose to do. Now, this is a conscious choice. This is the deal. The deal is I can do anything I consciously choose to do. So I'm not allowed to then just drift into some sort of like, I don't know, whatever, reading magazine articles, reading some blog post that somebody's dumped my way. I can do that so long as I go, this is what I'm doing now. I consciously choose it from the I that chooses. Or if I feel compelled to do so, I give myself permission to continue with whatever I've been doing for the last 45 minutes. So I may or I may not stop and do something else. Right. But I give myself absolute permission. There's no shoulding. There's no whatever. I just have a simple rule structure that I apply. I could choose to now get drunk if I wanted to. I don't drink, but if I wanted to, I could. Right. Now, what happens 99 times out of 100 is, of course, by that point, I'm in flow with the task. So 99 times out of 100, I will continue the task. And once I'm in flow, I actually have to do something else, which is make sure I don't then spend 8 hours writing the book if I had 8 hours and not moving until all the pool and all the blood in my body is pooled in the back of my legs. And, you know, my health is suffering. My joints are seized up. So I think it's unhealthy to stay in, and I can do that. Once I get into flow, that's the irony. The thing I procrastinate about, when I'm in flow with it, I will usually do it and do it and do it to the point of, you know, being in an awful state. And if I do that, if I don't move all day and I'm on a computer all day, it will affect my sleep. I will have difficulty going to sleep in the evening. So, and it has cascade effects. But that's basically, that's my MO. That's my way of putting myself under the yoke to get a job done when I go, no, got to get this thing done. That's my strategy.
To the next question. I won't ask any follow-ups, although I want to, but I won't. How do you deal with what people call mistakes or failure? And these are your own personal considerations, not when you're dealing with somebody else's. But when you are faced with something where you think, this isn't what I should be doing, like maybe you do stop within that 45 minutes, you actually find yourself surfing the internet because you stumbled across a YouTube video that is interesting and you realize, I should be writing now. However the verbiage is. What do you do in those moments, big or small?
Okay, so there's a couple of levels to this, because there's a sort of more philosophical way of relating to mistakes. And that's just simply not burning any energy on recrimination. With regard to my bias to living in the active present and non-linear generative engagement, there's a piece of advice from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, which he has in the afterword of the 10th anniversary edition of his book, Black Swan, I think.
Mm-hmm.
He said that he'd had complaints that the book didn't give any advice on how one ought to engage with life. It just pointed out how most people's way of engaging with life is wrong or ineffective.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, I'm a philosopher, so, I'm not really here to give you advice on that. But if I were to give you advice, it would be this. Expose yourself to serendipity, mitigate the downsides, and leverage the upsides. Now, I was quite moved by that, and it stayed with me as a heuristic, as a principle
mm-hmm.
for living. So at any given point, another approach that I have, and this comes from improv theater, is create with what comes up. When you're improvising with somebody, if you get into any kind of struggle in your mind and go, well, that wasn't a very good line they just gave me. What am I supposed to do with that? That was a bit of a dud. The rule in improv theater is you accept every offer, and everything that your improv partner or partners gives you is an offer. And it's irrelevant to judge it as good or bad. It does nothing. It's just what it is. You take it, you create forward with it. So improv theater, accept every offer, create with whatever comes up and is given to you.
Mm-hmm.
So I take this as a principle in life. Everything is an offer, everything to be created with. Now, that's on one level. So if for example, I spent the last 2 years trying to make a business project work that just is now looking like a sunk cost fallacy, just to pull a random example, instead of going, oh, well, that was a wasted 2 years, or it's like, okay, so what's everything I know now that I didn't know before? And what's everything I've got from this that's put me in a different place? Because I'm not the same guy I was 2 years ago. And that 2-year project, although it didn't yield what I had in mind for it, has changed me and informed me in so many ways that put me in exponentially more empowered position than I was before to do the next thing. So I'm creating with what comes up. And it's not a cheap reframe. It's genuinely what is the gold here? What's the gold in the shadow? That I can pan out, the gold I can pan from the grit. So that's one thing. But on a smaller level, and I'm more kind of like, oh, look, here I am. I put my timer on for 45 minutes. And now I'm on Facebook. What the hell happened there? Glitched out for a moment. So this piece of advice that my old coach and mentor, Steve Chandler, gave me, which is this. You're either on the path or you're drifting. And if you find yourself drifting, there is nothing that you need to do except for lovingly pick yourself up and put yourself back on the path.
Hmm.
And the key bit there is lovingly.
Right.
That's so important. I've worked a lot with what I call self-flagellators, people who are constantly going, oh, what the hell's wrong with you? You should know better than that by now. Oh, I'm always screwing stuff up. Like, why can't I get one thing right?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of self-hate, that kind of self-recrimination. I always ask people, I say, that self-flagellation thing that you do, has it ever helped you change yourself or your life?
Mm-hmm.
I've yet to have somebody say that it has.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't help. And in fact, I think it does quite the opposite. I think a lot of the times if we have something we want to change in ourselves, right, and we grip it tightly in a grip of loathing and hatred, that's what we do. We hold it tightly as it is. I hate that thing. Why do I always do that? And we hold it.
Yeah.
But when we loosen that grip of hating on it, because hating on it means seeing it in one way. We're caught in a way of seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
So all the time we see it that way, what we're excluding or pushing out are other ways of seeing it, other ways of relating to it. And if this way of seeing it, of hating on it, was going to change it would have done it by now. So what are all the perspectives that get pushed out by that hating on it? And hate and anger are narrowing in terms of view and vision. So what I think it's really important, and I make sure that that's a deal that all clients do with me, is they're going to learn to cut themselves tons of slack. They're going to learn to lovingly pick themselves up and put themselves back on whatever path they've been on. And if they have to do it 1,000,001 times, that's okay. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean anything about them other than they're a human being. Welcome to the human race. This is how we are. We drift.
Yep. Perfect. Yeah, I totally agree. All right. Final question. Mm-hmm. So what is your health and fitness routine?
Right now, my health and fitness routine is appalling. And it variously has been across the years. Sometimes I've been really super on it. For a long time, for a period of about 18 months, I was really on it solidly without any breaks in a progressive strength training program, mm-hmm. which really worked for me. Circumstances really worked for me. And partly it was circumstances as well. It became so embedded into the circumstances of my life that it became kind of effortless to do. And then those circumstances changed and a variety of other things have changed. So right now, up until Christmas time, I had a set of patterns that I was engaged with regularly that looked after my physicality and these sorts of things. And I was progressing towards certain outcomes with that. Now, what's happened since then is lockdown has occurred, another lockdown. I would take myself out of the flat, and I'm a member of Drumshuch, as it's pronounced up here in Scotland, Bars Club, which is a Victorian bars club. It has traveling rings, has a gym there, has a dance studio, and has a heavy bag. So I do some martial arts stuff up there. So, and it's just 5 minutes around the corner. So I get up, walk out, and I would go and do my thing there. So right now, I'm aware of what's going on in my mind. And what's going on in my mind is this lockdown is temporary. So I want to get, I'm just on pause until I get back from that. I haven't built something new for the different set of circumstances. Right. And I'm aware that I've not been giving it much consciousness or attention. And unconsciously, I've been thinking, well, at some point, we'll get back to that. But of course, the truth of the matter is here in the UK, they're being very cagey about when things like that are likely to reopen. It's oh, yes, we'll reevaluate on this date. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's not really saying anything. So I'm now getting to the point of thinking, okay, that's a month now that I've been away from. Now, what I have ad hoc. So I've been ad hoc doing things. I might do some pull-ups as I pass my pull-up bar. Some mornings I'm doing some SEALAT training and this kind of thing and doing some martial arts training. I've got a floor-to-ceiling bag. I do some stuff, but there's no structure around what I'm doing. And some days I am really underactive because I end up on the computer, end up doing business stuff all the time. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even going out for a walk because it's cold here at the moment and literally like cold to icy pavements. Mm-hmm. Can't even walk on them, going to slip over. So, right. So at the moment, if I wanted to get myself back into the groove with those things, what I would want to do is bring some consciousness to it. Number one, recognize, okay, we actually might be locked down here for quite a number of months. Do you want to be this inactive for a number of months? The answer is no. Mm-hmm. And then figure out what I'm going to do with regard to spending time with physicality. There's a formula that I run on a lot of things, which is the time spent with formula. I mentioned this about organizing my time rather than task. Mm-hmm. So time spent with physicality is the only way to develop or maintain and develop my physicality. So it would be, for me, and this is the way I tend to do it, is I'm likely to do this at some point soon, especially now I'm talking about it now, is make the mornings about physicality. So I do not get up and start working straight away. That's a disaster for me, right. Because I can work all day and I will stay, and then it'll be like, oh, it's 10 o'clock in the evening now.
Yeah.
So it's important to front load the physical stuff. So yeah, that's my view on it. And I've been more or less structured as well with my approach.
Mm-hmm.
Things. I think it is, I've talked about inside out stuff, where you go inside of your mind and how you organize your motivation, all of that kind of thing. But there is a lot to be said for environmental factors as well, making sure that you're setting your environment in an appropriate way to do the things that you want to do. When I was still doing my most focused, most sort of on it, most laser focused strength training, whereby literally I was making gains all the time because I had a great system where I could constantly make a gain by some metric. I might increase the sets, or I might increase the reps, or I might increase the weight. But in every session, there was some at least micro gain. And I love that because I could plot the fact that, I'm 18 months doing this and I'm still winning. Every session, there's a new win, right, without exception. Because I'd find that win in the session.
Yeah. And
I was doing that three times a week. But it was easy to do because one time I was working with my friend and personal trainer at the time. We've moved to different parts of the country now, so there's one change. One time I was working with him on a Friday because I home educate my kids. And people think home educating means that you're at home educating all the time. Actually, here in the UK, there are home education networks. So there are events going on that are organized amongst home educators. It's almost like you curate your own education for your kids, and you do it collaboratively with other home educators. So on a Friday morning at the Lee Valley Athletics Centre, where they train the British athletics team, they had an athletics session. So I'd take the girls to their athletics session. But to the side of the tracks, they've got like a load of calisthenic equipment, dip bars, pull-up bars, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I'd go down with my weights belt. And so on a Wednesday, I'd see my personal trainer. We'd work out together. On a Friday, I would always be there, and there was nothing for me to do except work out. Perfect.
Yeah.
And that meant that there was only one session a week where I had to kind of, go, all right, there's something that could conflict with that if I allowed it to. But it was a matter of, well, I've done 2 out of 3, so I'm not going to not do the third.
Right.
Just I never didn't do it because it would just seem, well, why would I not do it? Why would I skip it when I've done 2 out of 3?
Yeah.
So the third one, even though I had to be a little bit more self-organizing with it, I would always do. And I did that for a year and a half. And I totally loved doing that. And I was making consistent gains with it. And when I moved up to Edinburgh, I tried to reinstate that. But it was really difficult to recreate the conditions. So the gym that I was using was a 45-minute walk away.
Mm-hmm.
So at first I'm going, well, this is a good thing because I get to walk briskly for 45 minutes. That's a good thing. Then I'm working out, doing my strength training. Then I'm walking back for 45 minutes. But then it's like a huge chunk out the day.
Yeah.
So little things like that sort of started to mean that, and of course, I had to do that 3 times a week. Or at least if I was going to do 2, and I kept that going. And what I did is I actually did work out using roughly the same methodology for another year and a bit, but it started to get patchy and wobbly, and I'd skip some, and and then I'd go for like 3 weeks, and I wouldn't go, and then I'd start back up again, and it started to get wavery and patchy. So I knew that wasn't going to work, and that's when I changed my membership to this kind of private bars club that's got its own gym, which is 5 minutes around the corner. But I had to change up what I was doing because they didn't have the equipment that I wanted. I'm a simple man, actually, when it comes to strength training equipment. But it's amazing how often people don't have the equipment I want. Like, it's amazing how often there's no dip station somewhere.
Right.
Hotel gyms are the worst.
Yep.
Hotel gyms are terrible. You go in and there's a couple of exercise bikes, and it's just,
Yeah.
but so I just want a good dip station and a decent pull-up bar, and I'm good to go, and a weights belt, and an option to hang different amounts of weight on myself.
Yeah.
I don't do anything hugely extensive, but even a pull-up bar can be a challenge, just to get a bar, not something with 50 different handles to do. I just want a bar that I can grab the damn bar sometimes.
Yeah.
Dip stations, they are challenging to get. So at this new place, they didn't have a dip station. I said, look, could you get a dip station? Could you get a dip station? And they kind of did. They've got a couple of parallel dip bars, but they're super low to the ground. So I can't really get the depth that I want. I'm a reasonably tall guy. So I'm kind of working. Dips were a big thing for me for a long time, but I'm having to think, well, what am I going to do instead of dips? And body weight wise, I don't know. I'm not quite finding what's replacing that for me. I can't quite get the same thing that press ups that I do with dips, parallel dips. So basically my strength training is around squats, dips, pull-ups, and handstands.
So mostly calisthenics then, obviously.
Yeah, mostly calisthenics. If I do squats, I will do barbell squats.
Right. Body weight generally isn't enough unless you're doing pistols, one-legged squats or...
Yeah, and since my knees are in shocking condition,
right.
I'm not saying I can't do pistols. I could, but I would want to work up. I'd have to really do a lot of stability. It would probably do me good, but I would want to be giving myself a lot of assistance with pistols, I think, to start with. I never really bother with bodyweight squats. If I do bodyweight squats, I will do them Russian style, which is an extremely slow count of 20.
Okay.
All the way down, and an extremely slow count of 20 on the way up. And the trick is to keep it even,
right?
So as to not rush through the painful bits.
Yeah.
You're always moving,
yeah,
but as slowly as possible. And with the kind of Russian stuff from Russian martial arts, they do a lot of interesting bodyweight training stuff. It's about the breathing and about how you focus and breathe through the painful bits. Instead of rushing through the painful bit, you breathe and focus through the painful bit. I don't think it necessarily creates a lot of size and mass, but from a martial arts perspective, it's extremely useful because you want to be able to drop your body weight into your legs.
Right.
And with Russian martial arts as well, there's a lot of height changes. So if somebody's going to throw you, the trick is, as soon as you know you're starting to be thrown, you want to drop your body weight down. And you might drop it down all the way to the ground, because if you end up on the ground because you dropped yourself to the ground, that is a preferable situation from being on the ground because you got thrown on the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
So you get a lot of height changes as a mode of escape.
Yeah.
So that's why they condition the legs that way.
Cool. Yeah, I really do appreciate you taking the time. I know that you are super busy. You've got a lot of projects going on. I know you have your own podcast coming out. And
that's right, yeah. It should be tomorrow, in fact. The first one should be dropping as we're recording this now. But
oh, really? Okay. Very cool. I'm going to check that out. I'll put a link to your podcast as well in the show notes here. I think that you're a very unique thinker, and that's why I've been following you for years, and I bought most of your products, and I've gotten coaching from you, and I'm in a membership group right now that you've got running. And I really appreciate how you think. Like, you're unique. You're a very philosophical thinker, and you have that ability to look from different perspectives at a lot of things. You don't just take an answer. You actually will examine it, and you'll think about it. You'll roll with it a little bit, to use that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu metaphor, to discover what it actually is. And that, I think, is fairly unique, actually. You leave it up to the people who are listening to you. So you invite thought, which is why I'm a huge fan. And I've been looking at your journey since I stumbled across that first PDF that you offered, which was Hypnosis Without Trance. And the whole idea of, hey, here's another way of looking at hypnosis, which I thought, I like this. And I've been paying attention ever since. So I really do appreciate the time you're taking here. There's a lot of excellent golden nuggets that I think people are going to be fascinated by and really take on board. So thanks a lot, James. I really appreciate everything you do. And I like that you are continuing to do it, that you're still enthusiastic.
Yes, I am. And thank you, Korey, for inviting me on, because, it's, I enjoy exploring these things as well. So it's always great to be invited on a podcast where somebody's asking questions, I think, that are driven by seeing themselves. I've been interviewed enough times. Now, there's two types of interviewers. There are the interviewers who are genuinely seeing something and are curious about something. And then there are interviewers who get a stock number of rote questions and they just kind of ask them. Mm-hmm. And you're very much that former kind of interviewer. And I'd like you to know that I really value that. I think that's an important thing, and it makes you a good interviewer.
Cool.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I know the viewers and the listeners are really going to get a lot of value out of this, for sure. That brings us to the end of another episode of the Stoic Strength Trainer podcast. I appreciate you making the time to listen to this extra long episode. If you like what you heard, please do share it with someone you believe might like it too. This is Korey. If even one more person learns to operate with excellence in the moment of choice, the world has become a better place. Catch you next time.